My name is Jose Ignacio Hernandez, visiting fellow at the Grove Lab, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this event about the recent report, the Venezuela Enterprise. I wish to thank the director of the Grove Lab, Professor Ricardo Hausman, and the Grove Lab team that helps in the organization of the event, particularly to Katia Gonzalez. This is the second event that we organize about current Venezuelan problems. The first one was dedicated to analyze the implication of the Venezuelan migrants and refugee crisis. And today, we will have the opportunity to discuss a recent report published by the Inter-American Development Bank, the Venezuela Enterprise. The IDB, together with the Venezuelan most prestigious School of Management, the Instituto de Estudios Superiores de Administración, IESA, and with the support of more than 30 business chambers in Venezuela, carry out the enterprise survey with a sample of almost 300 companies. The instrument access firms obstacles such as access to finance, infrastructure, competition, and performance of companies, among other variables. More than 164,000 interviews have been conducted in 144 countries. Simultaneously, the IDB carried out the World Management Survey. This survey analyzed management aspects that allows a deeper understanding of the productivity of companies based on a sample of 100 companies in Venezuela. The World Management Service has performed more than 20,000 interviews in 35 countries. The main findings of the survey are analyzed in the paper, The Venezuelan Enterprise, written by Jose Luis Saboin. The papers contribute to several strands of the economic literature. It offers additional evidence relevant to the literature on populism, state capacity, and economic outcomes, particularly in Latin America. It helps to understand the behavior and survival of firms in times of economic distress. The paper also contributed to the understanding of the role of internationalization in firm survival. And finally, it contributes to the literature that studies the determinants of labor productivity at the firm's level. Event speaker Jose Luis Saboin, economist at the Inter-American Development Bank and author of the report, will present the findings, followed by a panel discussion featuring Miguel Ángel Santos, Director of Applied Research at the Grove Lab, Maria Cecilia Acevedo, economist at the IDB Invest, Carolina Pagliacci, professor at the IESA in Venezuela, and Emmanuel Abuelafia, economist at the Inter-American Development Bank. You can make your questions and commentaries through Zoom. I will ask, please, to be sure that your microphones are mute, and we should have time at the end of the event for an open discussion. Please join me in welcoming Jose Luis Saboin.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, let me share my screen. Okay. I want to thank you first, Jose Ignacio, for organizing not only this event, but a series of events regarding Venezuela. Thank you for that, to keep the world engaged on thinking about Venezuela. Least to say that I am delighted to be here at this seminar with this distinguished panel and to talk about the matter that I am passionate and enthusiastic about. Before doing that, I also want to start. I want to thank Harvard University, the Grove Lab, and Professor Hausman for providing this space for discussion. And last, I want to thank again the IDB, IESA, and all the Venezuelans business chambers for this initiative, and particularly at the IDB to Osmel Manzano, Emmanuel Abuelafia, and at IESA at Richard Oguchi, and all the firms that participated in the study. So without further ado, let me start with the presentation. So the natural question that gathers us here is why we are doing this. And put simply, as you can see in the chart, the Venezuelan economic crisis is the most severe economic depression in the last 60 years in the world, worse than Rwanda in the 80s, worse than Ukraine and other transition economies in the 90s, and worse than the Zimbabwe 2000 crisis in the 2000s. Sorry. As you can see there, the contraction has been up and above 75% of GDP. But the fact that stands out is that when the economy was growing in the 2000s, as you can see in the chart in the left, which was fueled by an oil boom that translated into a consumption boom, firms were disappearing. No, I took this chart from Conindustria, and this is like a survey on it's in Spanish, but I will translate it to you. This is the number of industrial establishments in the country starting in 1997. As you can see there, firms were actually contracting, no? The number of firms, especially or more recently since 2007, 2008, when the first socialist program was put in place, and exacerbated, of course, in 2014 when the socialist model unraveled. So our interest is therefore that the survivors know what happened to the survivors to the greatest depression the world has seen in the last 60 years. No? And in this sense, I want to highlight the advantage of these surveys. And the main advantage of these surveys that we carried out is that they are global. This means that we can get a comparative perspective of Venezuelan firms with the standard methodologies, which at the same time provide an extensive literature on firm performance. So now let's see some of the results of the first survey that we carried out, the enterprise survey. But before that, I want to talk about the challenges that we faced when we did this. So the question that you might ask is that how to get data in a country with no statistics, when institutions are turned off, when there is near zero public-private dialogue? Well, I will say that you have to get it from scratch. So what we did is that we engaged in dialogue with all the business chambers in the country, and we got a help of their directories. And the first striking result was that from a directory that had around 10,000 companies in 2006, right now that directory has like 4,000 companies. And out of those 4,000 companies, we tried to contact 2,000 companies, and look what happened. On the left, you can see all the firms that were contacted for the survey. And as you can see, around 900 of them did not answer a call. Around 900 as well were reluctant to answer the questionnaire. Around 600 actually closed operations in the period that the survey was carried out. 114 were affected by COVID, and some 38 were about some sort of a state control, leaving 263 that actually carried out the survey. And these challenges are, like condensed in three main factors. One is the complexity of the survey and the time it takes to answer it. We have like around 1,000 answers per firm. And the fact is that firms actually forgot about this survey, because the survey has to be carried out tops like every 3 years. And in Venezuela, more than a decade went by the last survey was carried out. The other factor that was behind the challenges that we faced was the economic depression itself, like the lack of resources that the firms have to answer these things, the multidisciplinary or multi-area background that the survey has. Service interruptions. Sometimes there were no phone, no internet. Sometimes managers were out of the country, and that was very difficult, no, for us to carry out that information. And to make things worse, the second part of the survey was carried out in the mid of the COVID-19 pandemic and in the middle of a gasoline scarcity. The result of this is that, as you can see in the table on the right-hand side, is that the survey wasn't fully representative, but as a Venezuelan song says, esto es lo que hay. Moreover, the survey is tilted or biased towards manufacturing. As you can see here, as you can see, the actual coverage over the theoretical coverage of the sample, it's biased toward manufacturing. But to me, or per se, this is a feature and not a bug. The other thing is, to whom shall we compare Venezuela? As I mentioned 2 minutes ago, one of the benefits of this exercise is that it allows us to put Venezuela on a cross-sectional perspective. But Venezuela is not what it was at the last year of growth. It had growth, to say the least. No? So as you can see in both charts, from leading the Andean region, no, which is a middle income region, to be one of the lagged countries of the Central American region, which is a low-income region. Or put another way, Venezuela went from above Colombia to below Honduras. So taking this into account, we will show results for firms in these two groups of countries, and thinking about the Andean countries of the group of countries that Venezuela will aspire to be in the short term. So now going to the results, to me, the main characteristic of the survival firm in Venezuela is not that it has aged or that its management has more experience, which are both important, of course, but the important thing is that what is the surviving firm doing to survive? And to me, the most striking one is that the Venezuelan firm increased its ties with the rest of the world. And as you can see in the first chart on the left, firms in Venezuela are exporting substantially more than before, no? Like on 2006, around 2% of firms, 3% of firms were exporting directly 10% of sales. And in the last survey, around 10% of the firms that answers the questions were exporting at least 10% of firms. Another striking difference was in foreign ownership. As you can see, Venezuela, the share of Venezuelan firms that has some sort of foreign ownership triples those of the comparator countries. And this might be due to at least three factors. First, those who manage to diversify their markets and risks, especially geographic risks, and that allows them to change residency. You know, they are living in other countries, but they keep their businesses in Venezuela. A second factor could be that the foreign companies are allowed or are still operating in Venezuela. And the third factor is related to newcomers, people that entered in Venezuela in the last 5 years. The important thing about foreign ownership is that this creates access to modern technologies and international markets. And in this sample, this feature is significantly correlated to high levels of productivity, particularly in large firms. The other sign that the Venezuelan firm has increased its ties with the rest of the world is the possession of an internationally recognized quality certificate. And the literature on this argues that having these certificates leads to higher quality of monitoring, better product risk management, knowledge spillovers. And in this sample, this is associated with productivity increases, especially in the service sector. Now, I want to talk about the main obstacles that firms currently have in Venezuela. I am going to talk briefly about them because the idea is to tease the panel on these topics. No? And what I want to highlight on this chart is that it contains a lot of information in a single chart. First, you can see the blue bar, which is the share of firms that respond, which is the biggest obstacle for them, the main obstacle. And as you can see, the blue bar is for 2019 and the yellow bar is for 2010. And as you can see, in 2019, the main obstacles that the firms say they have is the macroeconomic environment, political instability, lack of electricity, but this is also associated to other services, credit, practice of informal sector, and so on and so forth. But take a look at the yellow bar. The yellow bar shows crime, shows political instability and electricity at the top. And I want you to think about these issues as the latent problems that firms in Venezuela will have if, let's say, a comprehensive recovery strategy is put in place. The other thing is that we also want to compare this with the main obstacles for the peer countries, for the firms at peer countries. And as you can see, the main obstacle that they find is the practice of the informal sector. And it's interesting because in Venezuela, there is also lots of informality, but as you can see, it's only ranking 5th place right now. So we also have to think of these issues as well as the latent problems of Venezuelan firms. For instance, the role of taxes, the role of credit, the role of corruption. So I'm going to leave the discussion of these topics to the panel, but I just want to show you a little bit of the facts of the results that we get from the survey. Here you can see that service interruptions are at the order of the day. On the left-hand side, you can see service interruptions for the average responding firm. The blue bar just states the number of outages per month that they have on different services. As you can see, around 8 to 10 outages a firm in Venezuela has per month in internet, in electricity, in water, and cellular connection. And also, these represent significant losses. As you can see, around 10% of sales are the service interruptions taking of the firm. And on the right-hand side, I want to highlight that the firms are actually taking, they are taking care of their problems on their own, no? In the absence of the state, thanks to the collapse of the state, you can see the blue bar that from 2010 to 2020, from around 50% of the firms reported that they had like a power generator, and right now this share of firms it's reaching the 50%. But an important thing is that the share of the generation that these power plants provide is close to 40%, which means that they can do things, but they still are relying on the precarious situation of public services. The other thing that I want to show to this panel is that the relationship with credit has deteriorated. As you can see on the left-hand side, the share of firms that have a credit line or a loan is quite low in Venezuela when compared to peers. It went from 40% to 20% in 10 years. And in this sample, it is significantly associated with high levels of productivity in general, and especially in manufacturing and small firms. Moreover, like more than 50% of the firms report difficulties obtaining a loan, and rejection rates in Venezuela tripled those of peers. And when asked about why this is happening, most firms report that this is associated with unfavorable amounts and maturities, and that the complexity of the getting a loan, the process is really high, especially for small firms. And the consequences of this, as you can see in the chart on the right-hand side, is that that firms are financing themselves with retained earnings. As you can see, the blue bar here, this is decomposed by firm size. You can see that around 50%, or sometimes, around 60% of the sources of how they finance their working capital is coming from retained earnings, and a non-despicable share is coming from their own capital for private equity. And as you can see, private banks is small, particularly for small firms, and public banks is non-despicable, which makes us think about the role of public banks in the future. And I don't want to go into the details, but I just want to highlight that the banking system situation in Venezuela is pretty dire. More recently, is due to the less liquidity in the hands of banks, which gives, on the one hand, more seigniorage to the government, but on the other hand, it has a lower impact on the exchange rate and inflation compared to the previous rates when the research requirements were not rising. And the important thing here is that this is giving credit, no? Moreover, the system is equity. The equity of the bank is subject to bonds or in default. The system is also subject to decades of high inflation, not just only the hyperinflation, of controlled interest rates or fiscal voracity of the government. More than half of the bank's portfolio is in hands of internal debt bonds. There are lagged fees and commissions. There is a slowdown in the transactional volume of the banks due to the early dollarization and disorganized organization that we are seeing, and also an increase in operating expenses, that the banks has due to the hyperinflation. So the situation of the banking system is really hard in Venezuela nowadays. The other thing that stood out is that immigration has marked changes in the use of the labor factor. When you ask the firms about, what is the main source of lacking skills in the economy, they say that it's migration, but also that the quality of the education system has lowered down. But then we wanted to go further and think about how big are these gaps. So and we took advantage of the questions and we compared what the firm, an average firm in Venezuela, is expecting on the human capital of a worker by occupation, and what it actually gets, no? And as we can see on the left-hand chart, we see that around a third of firms say that they cannot match the human capital on operators and assemblers. Around also 1/3 on clerical support, service, and sales. And the share of firms lowers down in terms of professionals, or managers, and elementary occupations. But when we look at how wide was that gap, I mean, Maybe you are expecting, for instance, a worker to have like, I don't know, university training completed, and what you get is a worker that has primary education completed. Well, what we see is that the gaps are really small. So it's just like a one level that they are not getting. So as you can see here in this table, on average, we see that the expected average, level of an operator for a Venezuelan firm is to have secondary education. And when they are getting on average is primary education, just one tier. The same happens on clerical support. They ask they have completed a vocational or university training. And what they get is a person that has some study, but hasn't completed. And the same happens with services, and at other levels, there are no gaps. But it's interesting that at least at the technician level, like vocational training, they expect them to not complete it, but what they get is that they have a person that has completed them. And the antidote, the key to solve this, I think, is that to have ongoing company training. And the problem is that in 2010, almost 80% of workers in Venezuela had some sort of in-company training. Now in 2020, this figure has lowered to 40%, and in peer countries, it's around 60%. So I think this is key because it will be relatively fast to increase learning in the firm in Venezuela, and this can have spillovers for the whole firm. Thinking more about the takeoff, I think that relaxation and optimization of labor laws and the role of those who migrated will be key to boost human capital in the country. And to finalize on this survey, I just want to talk about the innovation. And I think from the survey that innovation is alive and kicking in Venezuela. As you can see on the chart on the left, when we look at the characteristics of this innovation, we see that around 80% of firms changed a method or a production process. And I think about this on hyperinflation. No? In a country with hyperinflation, if you don't innovate, if you don't change processes or methods, you will be killed by the wave. However, this innovation is mostly related to package or presentation, not to new products as we see in other countries. Around 40% of the innovating firms said that they are using a licensed technology. Around as well, 30–40% of firms changed their organizational structure, and around a little bit more than 20% bought a new assets. When we see then the implications of this innovation is that around 40% of the firms that had an innovation claim that this opened access to new customers, that this increased sales, that reduced average cost per unit of output, that increased number of product lines, that improved the product quality, and improved the ability to develop new technologies. And I don't want to finish something about this survey without mentioning 3 other obstacles that are key. And one is corruption that is omnipresent in the Venezuelan economy, especially compared to peers. Crime that is actually expensive, and tight regulations. And regarding tight regulation is that they are not gone for good in Venezuela, despite some things that we are seeing right now. Now I want to talk very briefly, around 5 minutes, about the World Management Survey, which is the second survey that we carried out, as Ignacio introduced. So why the World Management Survey? So, well, as you know, there are wide differences in the performance of firms that cannot be explained, considering traditional inputs like capital, labor, technology. And traditionally, researchers have found that a portion of this differential, what economists call TFP, total factor productivity, has been related to different levels of quality in management, mostly related to the literature that Nick Bloom and Rafaela Sadun of HBAs have been developing over the last 2 decades, I would say. But the important thing regarding the World Management Survey is that we are looking at how the organization is geared to accomplish the business of objectives. So as you can see here, this is on the left-hand side, you can see the overall score of the World Management Survey. As you can see, Venezuela is on the last position. Really, I mean, the difference in this index are low, but just to give you an idea, for the United States, Japan, and Germany, the score for an average firm is around 3 to 3.5. And as you can see here on the right-hand side, we see that the Venezuela, which is the blue distribution, is tilted toward the lower score, no? And it contrasts, for instance, with the Peru distribution that shows that the scores are tilted toward the higher scores. And the key here is that, although a 1-point score increase is difficult to obtain, like I say, overnight, it is significantly less expensive than the equivalent increases in capital and labor. For instance, according to the WMS estimates, 1 point increase on this score equates to an increase of 65% in capital and around 25% in labor. And this happens regardless of size, sector, profitability levels, etc. So when we decompose this index, and although Venezuela is below the region in most practices, we see that Venezuelan firms are competitive in talent management, and also on operations. As you can see, the index is decomposed into monitoring, operations, targets, and talent. And just to give you a flavor of what we are talking about, let's say for monitoring, a score of 3 in monitoring, for instance, suggests that key performance indicators are being collected on a regular but not as frequent basis, let's say bi-weekly instead of daily, and then only available to senior management. And this also consider the role of follow-up meetings and how these meetings are communicated to the whole company and how formal or informal they are. So just to give you a little bit of understanding, a score of 4 makes monitoring, like more frequently, a greater number of employees have access to these indicators, and these results are discussed, identifying problems and solving them concretely, and results are clearly communicated and understood by employees. I take one example from a country that they took a manufacturing firm that produced rice. When the worker knows that, for instance, when its average performance lowers from two bags of rice, I don't know, let's say per day, it has a notion that the probability of a salary increase goes down. So this is more or less what we are evaluating on this survey. To see what is associated with these scores, and in line with previous findings, our results for the Andean region show that age, size, and exports are associated with better management practices. The charts just show that show a representative firm of a sample that is below and above the median management score in the respective countries. And as you can see, for the case of Venezuela, Venezuela is not an exception, and it's actually a clear example of this. The firms that export more, that are larger, and that they are older have a better performance. However, best management practices are affected by various obstacles. And here I chose 2 just to motivate the discussion. And here we asked the firms about the human capital challenges. We asked them how an obstacle is to find qualified managers. So you can see here, when compared to Bolivia, Ecuador, and Peru, Venezuela, firms, here we are decomposing by firm size. It's very hard to find qualified managers than other countries. They report major obstacles more and minor obstacles more. And the same happens to regulatory challenges. We asked them about labor regulations, and as you can see, Venezuela and also Bolivia, but see for Venezuela, and particularly for medium-sized and large firms, these are important obstacles. And just to finish on a positive note, to end on a positive note, when I was checking the results, of course I expected Venezuela to be lagging, but I got curious and asked myself, is Venezuela leading at something? Are Venezuelan firms leading at least some indicator? Where is Venezuela leading? And I actually found that Venezuela leads the use of data for decision making. As you can see here, this is an index that measures how often and how efficiently they use data for taking decisions at the firm. But the problem is that when we try to see the relationship of these here in the right-hand side with the scoring management practices, we see that, for instance, when a Venezuelan firm, a Venezuelan representative firm, and a Bolivian representative firm start from scratch with no data for decision making, as they increase, the return for Bolivia is higher than Venezuela. The slope of Bolivia, which is actually very similar to the slope of Ecuador and Peru, it's more tilted upwards. No, so why is Venezuela not having those returns as the other countries? And the short answer that I have is that because of all the things that I mentioned before, no, the obstacles, macro, political, electricity, water, internet, etc. No, corruption. But what we are doing right now with this data, no, I'm thinking about the recovery. And with this slide, I end my presentation, is that we are currently working on different policy scenarios and doing simulations with this data. And one of them is doing like a what if exercise, no? Like taking a representative firm in Venezuela, like with average size, average age, average data use, average property structure, but provided with the same levels of exports, as a proxy of open markets with the same regulatory burden, just to take a flavor of a more flexible labor environment and the same access to human capital of these countries, no? And what we see is that Venezuela today will step like 2 positions, no? It will go above from Bolivia and Colombia and looking towards Peru. So it's important, no? Management is really important. And as I said at the beginning, no, increasing management score is really cheaper, no, than capital and labor. With that, I finish my presentation and thank you very much for your time and attendance.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jose Luis, for this wonderful summary of the report. And now, please join me in welcoming Miguel Ángel Santos, Director of Applied Research at the GROB Lab.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Jose Ignacio. Thank you very much for the invite. Always good to talk and share my thoughts on Venezuela and on this wonderful piece of work. I wanted to start there. I'm sure I browsed through the participants and got to see the names of many Venezuelan friends, but also of many people that aren't Venezuelans. So just to say that, as Jose Luis said, the enterprise survey hasn't been conducted in Venezuela for 10 years. It was conducted in a context of severe economic depression. It was conducted in a context of gasoline scarcity that prevented people from moving around. It was conducted in a context of collapsing telecommunication that made it difficult to reach by phone or by internet or sending and receiving responses. And the end of the study overlapped with the COVID-19 pandemic, which I think it's also very telling. So with all that in mind, and taking into account the long time that has passed without a survey being carried on Venezuela of this sort, one can only commend the efforts for bringing Venezuela to the light and providing some data that can be used, as Jose Luis states very well in the document, to motivate further study. I found it interesting that out of the 3,000 firms that were targeted in the random sampling, a third couldn't be contacted, a third indicated explicitly they didn't want to participate, and 20% had closed operations by the moment they were contacted. So when Jose Luis says that they're talking about survivors, I don't think that the guys that haven't been used to the Venezuelan experience, when you hear the word survivors, you think it's kind of a metaphor that we're using. And in Venezuela, when you say survivors, that happens to be very much the case. So I'm gonna comment on 3 aspects of the study that called my attention, and one has to do with the survivors precisely. One word that will come to mind quickly, it's survivorship bias, which is an expression that I didn't find in the study when I Control F it, and that I think it's permeating the study to a large extent when we read interesting things, just like that companies that survive tend to have a higher share of international certificates. You have no idea if the companies that died also had a similar share of certificates. And when they say that they were good at keeping talent, you don't know if the ones that died were as good as keeping talent as the one that survived. So we are in the face of that thing of all successful people wake up at 5 a.m. in the morning, but we just don't have visibility of where the people that wake up at 5 a.m. in the morning and didn't succeed went. And I think that's an interesting aspect that I think could have been filled, and for the next time might have been filled, by providing a profile of the firms that didn't want to participate. Of course, it will not be as complete as a profile as the one that participated. It cannot possibly be because they didn't respond, but at least in characteristics, in location, in industry, so that we get a sense, is the sample we're looking at of survivors relatively similar to, in certain baseline characteristics, to the ones that didn't survive, so that we could have a better sense of what could have been possibly determined the way they survive. So that's my first comment. It's regarding survivorship bias. My second comment relates to the peer group that was chosen. As Jose Luis was saying, Venezuela has experienced one of the largest collapse that we have seen, the largest in Latin America for sure, one of the largest in the world, the largest that do not consider civil war conflict. I just got a few slides from a study that I did with Douglas Barrios on economic collapse following the Barrow definition of a collapse. And what we get to see here in this slide that I'm presenting is, here you have the CAGR of the country that suffered the collapse in the 10 years after the collapse. And here you have the loss in GDP per capita during the collapse. So we can begin on our right finding Liberia lost 90% of GDP over a long civil war. And then you have all former Soviet republics like Georgia, Tajikistan, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Kyrgyzstan. Then you start finding Iraq, which when we think about the Venezuelan collapse, it's kind of like the best we could possibly aspire, because it's one of the countries that has grown the fastest after losing 50% of GDP. So Venezuela happens to be now in this realm that it has lost 75% of GDP in 6 years. And to me, it would have been extremely informative to know the firms in Venezuela after such a grandiose collapse. Are they similar to the ones that survived in Georgia? Are they similar to the ones that survived the Liberian Civil War? It is not as helpful to me to compare those firms with Bolivia or Peru, because in Bolivia or Peru, I mean, they are nowhere close to experiencing the large degree of collapse. And just to complete the idea here, this slide made the point that the countries fallen the most are the one growing at a higher rate. But just to complete the idea, they grow at a higher rate because they started at a lower base. And here is the loss in GDP. And here you have where they are 10 years down the road with respect to the pre-level collapse. So Liberia, in spite of being one of the ones that grew the most, remained 10 years after the end of the collapse at 20% of GDP. Iraq had a GDP 70% higher than the pre-collapse level. And that's why I say that maybe Iraq would have been a good example to look at, not only because of the recovery, but also because of the successful debt restructuring they went through. My last point has to do also with that sampling, is that we are comparing Venezuela to countries where a market economy predominates. And that really troubles me, because you can think that the skills that had allowed the firms that Jose Luis interviewed and identified together with the people at IESA are firms that have certain skills that are different from the skills that will allow you to thrive in a market economy. So in a market economy, you would expect how unique your product is, how many patents you've got registered, how well you handled the market through marketing techniques, how efficient you are at producing, what's the latest state of technology do you use, how much talent are you able to act and combine. When you think about the traits that might help the companies we're looking at to survive in Venezuela today, I think they might have survived because they had a capacity to escape the radar of government. I think we never had better understood the Chinese curse that says, I hope the government pays attention to you, as when the whole government or regime of Venezuela started. So I think successful companies have somehow escaped the radar of the government. That's one skill, have managed to circumvent the destruction of market mechanisms, overcoming control of prices, control of margins, control of profits. Maybe they have to bribe people for that. Jose Luis mentions that at a great length in the study. Maybe they have to invest a lot to protect themselves from crime. And at last, maybe they had to partner with government, formally or informally. So Jose Luis finds that a third or 30% more firms have government as a partner than over the previous study. I'm sure that's an understatement, but it's what it's coming out in the numbers. But partnering with the government, formally or informally, might have helped these companies to survive. And with this, I close my intervention. I'm deeply concerned about we using this to think about what Venezuela needs in the event of a potential recovery, because I think what it forms better the prospects of a recovery is what we have not today. And I am not entirely sure that we can rely on the skills that have helped these firms to survive, to foresee or prepare policy or forecast or plan a scenario where they can just start using their capacity at full length within a market economy where they have to compete with players that are coming from abroad or Venezuelans bringing in new technology. So more informative of the spectrum of recovery to me is what we have than what we don't have. Having said that, the study provides a glimpse into what we have. I think that's the base for all practical purposes. With whatever we have, we begin with to recover. And knowing what are the most binding constraints to the ones on board, it's informative. And in that sense, I do welcome the effort, appreciate the study, and commend Jose Luis and IDB for looking into this.
Thank you so much, Miguel Angel. Now, please me joining Maria Cecilia Acevedo, economist at the IDB Invest.
Thank you, Jose Ignacio, and hello, everyone. My name is Maria Cecilia Acevedo. I'm an economist at IDB Invest. And IDB Invest is the private sector institution of the IDB Group. And I'm delighted to have been invited to this panel today because all of us here today are really interested in better understanding the challenges that Venezuelan companies face, some factors of resilience, and some windows of opportunity toward the future. In this panel, I'm going to provide my comments regarding both challenges of opportunities for growth from a methodology that we have been working at the Inter-American Development Council. Perhaps some people who have their microphone open.
Dale pues, chao, chao.
Which is the development gap methodology. This is also the analysis that I'm going to present today is also joint work with Joaquin Lennon at IDB Invest, and Luciana de la Flor, who is an external consultant and also Harvard Kennedy School graduate. The idea behind the methodology that I'm going to use today to provide my comments is to compare a set of indicators from specific sectors in relation to what the level of development of a country would suggest according to its income per capita in each year when we analyze. Here, I think it's very important the points that we just heard. When the country performs better than this prediction, then we say that it has a positive gap. But if the country's performance is worse than this prediction, then we say that the country has a negative gap. And we have rescaled the gaps that I'm going to show you between -100 and 100. So they fluctuate in this rank. So let me show you an example of the methodology using some data from the distance to frontier index, which is associated to the ease of doing indicator, ease of doing business indicator from the World Bank, which is an indicator that fluctuates also between 0 and 10 and 100. And 100 is the frontier. It means the best regulatory practice. And each dot in this figure represents one country. And Venezuela in this figure and in the next figures is going to be represented by a red dot. So in this case, as you can see, Venezuela distance to frontier score at around 30 has a negative gap because it is below what is expected given the income per capita from this year, which is 2019, that is represented by the blue line. Our analysis of Venezuela shows that Venezuela has deep negative development gaps in the three macroeconomic and institutional aspects that were presented in the report. So infrastructure, financial development, and governance. And the figures that you see here are aggregates of the individual indicators from each of these areas of development using the global sample for close to 120 indicators. And these three composite indicators are negative, and that suggests that on these three areas, Venezuela sits below what could be expected given its GDP per capita for each analyzed year. Now, when we examine each of the sectors, some dimensions emerge as the most problematic factors. So for example, within infrastructure, the largest challenges are related to the efficiency of the different transport modes and relatedly the burden of customs procedures. In this slide, for example, Venezuela has a negative gap for the efficiency of air transport. The score, which is 2.4 on a scale of 1 to 7 in the Executive Opinion Survey of the World Economic Forum, represent an estimated gap of close to -100, which is the worst score. Now, Venezuela's performance is worse than the average of the poorest countries included in this analysis. Another problematic area is related to electricity quality. And here we're measuring, for example, the electric power transmission and distribution losses as percentage of electricity output. Now, since a country is better off when it has lower losses, in this case, a negative gap in this area is indicated by a larger number. So in this figure, you can see that Venezuela's performance is above the average for peer countries at similar income per capita. And the estimation of the gap in this case is actually out of bounds. Now, let me move to the third area of institutional quality, given that another commentator, Carolina, is going to analyze the financial development topic. According to the analysis that we have performed for Venezuela, the issues of business environment, regulatory quality, and violence present some of the largest negative gaps for the country out of all the topics included in our estimations. You can see in this figure the scores of regulatory quality for private sector development, which is one of the components of the worldwide governance indicators by the World Bank, which is a research data set that includes the opinions of individuals, enterprises, and experts in industrial and developing countries. And Venezuela is an outlier in this distribution. It is well below the predicted value and even the observed values for the poorest countries in this sample during this year. And our analysis suggests similar results for indicators such as the business cost of crime, as collected by the World Economic Forum Executive Survey, and also intentional homicides measured by the UN's Office on Drugs and Crime. Now, I would like to talk about opportunities now and concentrate on the issue of resilience that also Jose Luis mentioned at the beginning. In the report presented today, we could see that there is a subset of firms that thrive, that of course we know there are survivals, and we have some biases that are worth exploring, as was mentioned before. And we find in our own analysis of this data that, for example, firms that are innovating and growth when it's measured by company expansion because more employees are hired are correlated. Now, this is a correlation and not necessarily causation. But what we find is that at least in the manufacturing sector, having an innovation department is associated with an increase of 18 percentage points in the probability of company expansion. We have also found that companies that use cell phone, like digital technologies, increase the probability of growth by 30 percentage points. And we find this result from some descriptive regressions that control for other determinants of company growth, such as sector, age, and foreign ownership. Now, even though this is a correlation, because precisely when companies grow, they may need more cell phones and they may need more technology. We also find this result consistent with a strategy through which companies use digital technologies to manage the impacts of missing and incomplete markets, such as financial markets, as well as to deal with high levels of inflation that have made paper money transaction almost impossible. This is also an analysis from IDV Invest from some of my colleagues. And this analysis suggests that even though Venezuela has challenges in the telecommunication infrastructure and the quality of the associated services, people use digital technologies more intensively and for productive uses than in countries of similar income per capita. And Venezuela has in fact a positive gap in the use of making and receiving digital payments. More than 2/3 of adults, you can see here in this graph, report actually making these digital payments in the last year using the data from the Global Index from the World Bank. And in this figure also Venezuela is to the right, and it actually tops the rest of Latin America and the Caribbean in this figure. Now, those who do have access to financial services also use that digital services as well. And there is a positive gap in this variable. And this presents really a stark contrast with the results, the overall results that I presented before in infrastructure and financial development and governance. So let me conclude by saying that Venezuela has deep negative challenges in the areas, in many areas, and in particular in the studied areas, the macroeconomic of infrastructure, financial development, but also in institutional sectors. However, some companies seem to be resilient. They seem to be managing the impacts of these shocks that have impacted the population as well as companies. We are seeing that digital solutions are part of the resilience, one of the strategies of this resilience. It could facilitate company growth and the generation of formal employment. Now, toward the medium term, it's going to be important to tackle these very important constraints for company growth. We know from the historical evidence that infrastructure investments, but also financial development are really contributors to aggregate productivity and economic growth, and that the improvement of the business environment also contributes to entrepreneurship and employment. Thank you, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Maria Cecilia, for such wonderful presentation. Now, please join me welcoming Carolina Pagliacci, professor at the IESA in Venezuela.
Well, first of all, let me thank you for the invitation to participate in this webinar. And thank you, Jose Manuel, for that great presentations of results. My comments are going to focus on the potential impacts of credit restrictions. So first, I want to bring a result that Jose Luis showed, which is the percentage of firms with bank loans or a credit line. As you can see, that percentage has dropped significantly from 2010 to 2020. So right now, for the surveys, only 20% of the firms have had access to some form of banking credit. And we know by this survey and other surveys that typically the firms that exhibit like more troubles to get financing are small and medium firms. But in this particular survey, if we see the composition of firms, we can see that the percentage of large firms in the sample in 2020 is greater than in 2010. So basically 35% approximately of firms were large with 100 people or more. But what am I saying here? Well, basically that despite the fact that we have a lot of large firms in the sample, still we get this result, because theoretically large firms tend to have less trouble to get financing by banks. So so this just gives a perspective to the problem, and I think that it's important to say that the access to banking it has been reduced a lot. And of course, banking is one of the reasons why that is happening is because banks are lending less. I'm presenting to you a typical indicator of intermediation, which is the ratio of credit to deposit. You can see it from 2000 until the end of 2020. And as you can see, the mean of that indicator has dropped significantly, especially in the last 2 years of the sample. And there are many, let's say, causes that explain that behavior. But of course, one is the inflation acceleration that started in 2016. So basically, when we started seeing higher inflation rates in Venezuela, so you can see how this indicator dropped. But then you see a kind of temporary recovery during 2010. But that recovery basically had occurred during by the time of the monetary reconversion in Venezuela. So I believe that probably that was a sign that firms were getting more credit, basically because the cash in coins and bills in circulating in the economy were at its lowest. Okay, but then we had the central bank that started skyrocketing required reserve ratios. And that ratio even got to 90%. So that means that at some point, banks had to keep at the central bank 90% of their deposits. And you can see that the bottom of this line is exactly during 2019, 2020, exactly when the survey was collected. So I believe that this is saying that, in fact, credit is a problem in Venezuela. But exactly what does it mean for firms to having less banking credit? Well, probably that means that firms have less cash flows for undertaking their production. That means that probably they have more troubles paying in advance for imported inputs, labor, rent, storage, publicity, etc. But still, there are other means of financing. So if banks indeed are lending less, what firms can do, and actually we know that firms could resort to using retained past benefits or, for example, suppliers credit. But the piece of bad news here is that suppliers credit has suffered also a big drop. And if you compare 2010 with 2020, basically that drop has been of more than 20 points, because for the survey, the current survey, only 5% of the working capital of firms was financed with suppliers credit. So again, just to emphasize, the picture that we have here is that firms seem to have a lot of restrictions in terms of external financing. So in that case, what could be the firm's responses to that reduced external financing? Well, of course, the first possibility is that firms can simply cut back their production. That is, firms simply can adjust their production to the cash flows that they have available and reduce, let's say, the size of their businesses. But the other options that firms have is to use price financing, which means basically that they could increase their own prices to raise the enough cash flows to continue their production. Actually, we don't know. I mean, in practice, probably firms are using both of those strategies or a combination of them. But in the data, we actually don't know what strategy prevailed. So I think it would be interesting trying to find out what was the effect and exactly what type of strategy ended up prevailing in 2020. The general picture here is that, like economist says, is that firms are more financially constrained. But the thing here is that not all firms are equally constrained. So probably there are differences among firms that are worthy checking, right? And my hypothesis here is that the firms that tend to import more inputs are going to be the ones that end up being more financially constrained. And that's basically because we are in an environment of very high depreciations of the bolívar. So, so those firms that need to import more inputs probably are going to face, you know, the most or the larger financial constraints. And that's also a point that I think it's very interesting to check in the data. And just my last comment would be the following. Other than the restrictions in external financing, I believe there are other macroeconomic conditions that have worsened firms' financial constraints. And those conditions have to do with direct or indirect policy actions of the government. And I believe these are like 3 examples of that. For example, you can think of the excessive regulation and surveillance that the government has on firms. And in this point, I think as an example of, for example, of the transportation guides that firms had to follow to move their goods across the country. Well, that's cost for firms, and that's probably a reason for increasing financial needs at this time. Another macroeconomic condition is the deficient provision of public services. Even though firms have adapted to that, that means also that firms need to make up for that deficient provision of services. And that's going to increase financing needs too. But again, the problem here is that you have an environment that is increasing financing need, but at the same time, firms have more difficulties to find that financing. And finally, but not least, the insufficient cash provision in coins and bills by the central bank probably has been a factor that has troubled the operations of firms and probably has also increased financing needs. So just to close the ideas here, in a recovery, I think there would be 2 desirable conditions to meet for firms to take off in terms of lifting their financial constraints. And of course, one is that an environment that allows for wider firms access to bank credit. But of course, that has to be done with market incentives. I mean, that has to be done providing banks the right incentives to do so. And then we would need also an environment in which the distortions caused by direct or indirect policy actions would be reduced. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carolina. Now we have Emmanuel Abuelafia. Emmanuel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jose Ignacio. Thank you, everybody, to be here, and thank you for the invitation. I want to talk slightly about what's the future for Venezuela, what we think that could be the future, what had changed in the last 2 years about what the future would look like in Venezuela after all the changes that we have suffered in the last year and a half and two. Before the pandemic, we knew that the recovery from Venezuela will take time. Miguel Angel just showed how long, how you need to grow, how long it will take for a country to grow. The recovery rate for Iraq, it was really a 50% decrease in GDP, it was around 10%, less than 10% per year. So it would take a while. It took a while for Iraq to go back to the level it was before the crisis. We did a calculation for Venezuela. It would take more than 11 years, even before the crisis, to go back to the GDP level it was before the crisis. The recovery efforts would be expensive. We had done some calculations at the multilaterals, and all the academia, Plan País had done the calculations. Can differ the amount, can differ some third bodies about 30% of GDP per year at the beginning. Then after that, you could get less money. Less money will be required. Not clear. Not clear if, for sure, there is no possibility that each individual financial institution or each individual donor could put that money together to help Venezuela. There is a need to coordinate all the efforts. That's something that we knew from before. And that we knew from before that everybody tends to forget is that we need the private sector to be able to recover. The Venezuelans historically have a lot of resources abroad. If I don't get it wrong, they were the second country in the world to have assets abroad. They were around 64% of GDP calculated in 2007. If we go with the numbers right now, it's like 2 or 3 times GDP, which is, I don't know, let's say like around $200 billion abroad of Venezuelan private sector that could come back to the country. But you need to have a proper enabling environment for this investment to grow, to come back. But also you have to be careful. It's like giving an environment doesn't imply that you have to give everything. So that's a trade-off that the Venezuela government will face whenever the time comes, hopefully soon, about it. So we knew that it was expensive, we will take time, and we need a private sector. Then the pandemic hit. The pandemic hit, obviously, we know the cost for human cost and the cost for the economy. But in the case of Venezuela, it was hit in 2 other dimensions. First of all, Venezuela is not longer the only country in need, meaning like at the beginning, okay, Venezuela was such a crisis. You have a humanitarian crisis, poverty around above 90%. You have a lot of problems, infrastructure problems, blackouts, and everything. Was like you always will follow the news of Venezuela and the crisis developing in Venezuela, but now you have a lot of countries that have problems. So that the spotlight in Venezuela can diminish in the international community, given the other issues that are raising in the international view and in domestic parts. Like we haven't seen the vaccines. The vaccines first is like I solve my own problems, and after solving my own problems, I start looking about how can I help my neighbors. So this pandemic has shown and has impacted Venezuela in the sense of it's not the only country need for the international community. So the resources could be slightly scarcer than they used to be, or they would plan to be. Now, I'm getting something that is not familiar, it's uncharted waters for me, it's oil. I'm not an oil expert, but I want to highlight what some challenges that the pandemic have brought to Venezuela in the oil sector. Okay, whenever we start working or thinking about Venezuela before the crisis, before the pandemic, we were thought, okay, the only issue that we have to sort it out is how to get the production of Venezuela oil to 3 million barrels a day. Okay, that will be, if we sorted out how to do that, how to get the investment to do that, we can finance at least part of the recovery and we'll be fine. But COVID has hit. What implies that the demand for oil in general terms, even though before decarbonization, before thinking about getting greener, the country's getting greener and everything, before that, the global demand for oil had decreased around 2 or 3%. So that's a number that is substantial, especially for a country that based on oil. So that's something that's important to highlight. People who know more about it, like BP, had elaborated in September last year an energy outlook. In that energy outlook, start thinking about what could be plausible scenarios for 2050. 20 years from now. I know it looks like really long term, but it's not that long term. Whenever you are thinking about debt sustainability, Venezuela is going to take some debt in order to recover and then supposedly pay it back. But whenever you are thinking about 30 years, a number that you start thinking about debt sustainability analysis. So it's not that far. It's far. 30 years is far, but it's not as far as somebody thinks. So we need to start thinking about what's the new scenario for the oil and for the oil sector in general, and for Venezuela in particular. I want to show you some numbers, so I'll tell you some numbers about it, and then we can conclude. They have 3 scenarios. One scenario that is business as usual. That means like there's going to be a decrease in use of oil as a main source of energy from 33% that it is now to 23% in 30 years. It's okay, you're going to have a problem there because you have less demand, but it's not as much as they have another scenario. They call it rapid scenario, that the decrease in this case will come back to from 33% to 14% of the total energy. And if you go to a net zero, that is like the most desirable one, that will allow the country not to increase the temperature by less with the 1.5 degrees centigrade. That implies that the demand will come back to 7%. The demand for oil will be 7%. Then there's a problem is, okay, you have a decrease in the demand, but the other problem that you have is a fight. Okay, I'm an oil producer. What will happen is that if I am an oil producer and everybody else is oil producer, I will start competing with the other oil producers to be able to sell my production. So that's something that will affect the price that we'll get. So just to finish, to wrap it up, Venezuela is not in the same state and the same scenario as before. The recovery will cost money. We all know. We need to identify new sectors that will be able to finance the recovery for Venezuela. And we need to identify the sectors, economic sectors, and we need to identify what reforms need to be introduced at the beginning for these sectors in order to them to flourish. So it's not only to identify what sector will be mining or whatever sectors, but you need to identify what's the actual actions that you need to take for that. So that's one important conclusion I want to make. And the other one is like, more than ever, the private sector involvement is really key for a recovery in Venezuela. These firms that was surveyed by Jose Luis, the survivors, as they call, they give you a hint of who they are, what they do. Obviously, they are not. The survey is not perfect, but at least give you a hint what we are talking about. Thank you so much, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Emanuela Velafia, economist at the Inter-American Development Bank. I want to say that Emanuela and Jose Luis are authors of 2 IDB publications that I really recommend about Venezuela: a recent study about the COVID impact in Venezuela, and mainly a great study about a look to the future for Venezuela. I really recommend those reports that you can find at the IDB webpage. Well, it has been an exciting discussion about the current problems that the firms face in Venezuela amidst the unique economic collapse and an ongoing complex humanitarian emergency. We are almost running out of time, so we will not have time to answer all the questions. But however, I think that maybe we can work on 2 or 3 questions. So I'm going to start with the first question to Jose Luis Saboin. Jose Luis, can you tell us more about the composition of the firms that didn't respond to the survey?
Okay, thank you for that question. It's a very important question. The answer is that I don't know. The IESA provided us with the composition and not with the detailed data on sectors. But what I can answer about that is that these are some sort of directories from the business chambers that they actually get updated not as frequently as we would think they get updated. So think of it as a raw database with a phone number and an email and a name. And then when you reach it, then the name said, for instance, Jose Ignacio Hernandez in 2007, right now, it could be Jose Luis Saboin, the manager of the firm. So it's very few the information that we had on those companies. And as the chart showed, it was very, very difficult to get a hold on those companies. And I just want to add more like an invitation, to this, as I have been mentioning in other seminars, this was our first, we are just scratching the surface of the database. The IDB will make this database public, so then researchers all over the world can take a look at the data and get deeper analysis on any of the topics. So the invitation is to stay tuned and to get your hands in this database and provide more knowledge, which is what we aspire to provide to a Venezuelan society from the IDB.
Thank you so much, Jose Luis. Then we have this question that I will leave to the panel to decide who want to answer it. Higher use of data relative to others is a contradiction with the initial comment about lack of data in the country. What data are they using? Who wants to make a commentary on this?
That can only be responded by Jose Luis. Who wants?
Yes, exactly. So I actually don't understand the question. So what we can compare, and this is also related to Miguel Angel's comment. So we cannot compare data randomly. No, what we are comparing is the data that is available from the countries that carried out the survey. What we are using for these countries is the last survey available for the current.
Jose
Yes.
Luis, I realized when the person asked this question, you were talking about the World Management Survey and about, it was just your last point about how companies are using more intense use of their own data.
And what is it? So the question is how or?
Yeah, and the question was how to understand that in the context
Jose Luis,
of a country
yes.
that has less data.
Yeah, it's Luis, I'm sorry. The question,
Hola, Luisa.
¿Cómo estás? Disculpa. So you had this very interesting chart where you asked yourself, okay, we're ranking ourselves. Where is the one thing where we outperform the peer group? And you were very happy to report that it was in the use of data as a mechanism for decision making. And so it just struck me that what data, I mean, you're saying you started, your first disclosure was that there's such a lack of data. And so I started to think about, because there's lack of data, is it that there has been a privatization of data? And so therefore you need to use data, you need to contract private surveys, you need to contract firms that provide data, because it's the only way to understand your reality, because there's no official data of anything. So it's just understanding how the private sector will react, because I thought it was a very interesting observation.
Yes, no, I asked myself the same question, and the general answer that I can provide is that we don't know what they are reporting. I mean, firms in all of these countries, what are they calling getting access to data? No, from previous studies and from pure intuition in Venezuela, I will say this is data at the firm. No, think of a manufacturing firm on data, or or whatever, processes, operations, but also on external data. I would say that these people in a hyperinflationary environment, they get a held on, on dispatches, or I don't know, fuel prices in the black market, daily inflation from wherever they can get it, black market exchange rates and official. I mean, what my interpretation is that they are always, taking a look at numbers, because otherwise the wave is gonna wipe them out. So
Yeah.
this is what I think about when I look at that question. So, but this is super interesting, and we can correlate this thing with other variables from that survey in particular. But certainly it doesn't have the same returns. No, we will have to control for other stuff, but it's really interesting. And I just wanted to end with the thing that Miguel Angel mentioned, that I give to him as a challenge. Which was that firms in other countries that had these problems. No, so to try to make a quick comparison on those, you will need surveys, enterprise surveys for these countries, Georgia, what else, Armenia, and those countries. And I was doing like a quick search on the enterprise survey database, and we don't have data for data start before the 1995 or something like that. So we of course thought about it, but there is a comparative data set available for those countries. It would have been amazing to have those databases.
If you allow me to make a comment on that, Jose Ignacio, thank you.
Yeah, please.
Yes, I think that what Jose Luis was pointing out is important, because at the end, the firms try to adapt to an environment that is very complex, right? So maybe firms, exactly because they are in hyperinflation, and are trying to use more outside information to understand what they have to do. And I think the other result that is, the other strategy that is related to that point is the one that Maria was pointing out, because Venezuela appears like leading in digital payments use, right? And I would say that that phenomenon has to do a lot with the fact that the economy is with very low level of cash, right? If you, well, we don't have information at the central bank right now. All the statistics disappear. But basically, if you look at that ratio, the ratio of cash to deposits in the economy, you see that that ratio has got, before the monetary reconversion, to 1%. And I don't know what the numbers are right now, but in December 2020, they were close to 2% too. So maybe digital payments and the positive gap that Venezuela has to do exactly with the fact that there's no cash. So firms are forced to react in that way to survive.
Yeah, I just want to make one comment of people talking in the chat about the recovery of Venezuela and so on. Jose Luis responded that growing 15% for a decade, we get there in 11 years. The point is that, I mean, Douglas Barrios and I build up these databases of all the growth rates of all the countries in the world per decade on all the moving 10-year decade periods. That has only been achieved 0.4% of all possible countries of all possible rolling 10-year periods. So we are really talking here that when people ask how long will it take to recover the level of pre-collapse in Venezuela, I think we need to be a bit more realistic and even optimistic, but percentile 75, I think it's fine. Percentile 99.6, I mean, I would love for us to get there. I'm not sure we can make that happen.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a very appealing conversation. Unfortunately, time is over. As I said, it has been a very appealing conversation about the report, The Venezuelan Enterprise, which you can find at the IDB webpage on the publication site. And on a personal note, I think that this report helps to understand why the collapse of the state capability is the primary binding constraint to economic growth in Venezuela. According to the report, enterprises' main obstacles are related to state capabilities failures in areas of limited statehood, using the definition of rights, macroeconomic and political instabilities, and the lack of electrical and other essential services are strong evidence of how the gradual collapse of the Venezuelan state is a binding constraint to economic growth. Another evidence found in the report is the pervasive corruption and informal institutions or deals adopted to navigate bureaucratic administrative controls. Finally, criminality and the increase of private security services are symptoms of the state collapse. This is a significant result because it demonstrates that promoting a deregulation policy, substituting the exclusive economic institution with the inclusive one that restores the market mechanism will be not enough. After all, it will be also necessary to rebuild the state capability, but that for sure will be a topic for a new event. So thank you so much for participating in this event. Thank you to all the panelists for their excellent commentaries. Thank you to the Growth Lab, and see you until the next time. Bye-bye.